My 10-year-old niece shoved my expensive custom birthday cake off the table, watched it smash into the marble floor, and told me to eat it off the ground. My white brother-in-law chuckled and told me I was being too sensitive. I did not shed a single tear. I simply paid the $5,000 bill with a black card they had never seen and walked away. That night, my mother texted me that I was officially cut out of the family. She had no idea that by the next morning, I would execute a legal clause that would freeze all their corporate accounts and leave them facing the federal government. My name is Kiara. I am 31 years old, and I work as a corporate liquidator and hedge fund manager. For years, I let my family treat me like the invisible stepping stone so my golden child sister could shine. But that night at the steakhouse changed everything. We were dining at one of the most exclusive steakhouses in downtown Atlanta. It was the kind of establishment where reservations take 6 months to secure and the dress code is strictly enforced by intimidating hosts. My parents, Vivian and Desmond, insisted on hosting my birthday dinner there, not out of love for me, but to keep up their high society appearances. They obsessed over projecting the ultimate image of affluent black excellence to anyone who would look. My older sister Monique arrived 30 minutes late, wearing a designer gown she definitely could not afford. Her husband Trent trailed right behind her, loudly complaining about the valet service. Their 10-year-old daughter Harper immediately started complaining about the menu, loudly declaring the food was disgusting. I sat quietly in my simple silk dress, paying for my own drinks, while my family unapologetically ordered the most expensive items on the menu. Trent ordered a $200 bottle of premium bourbon and did not even bother to look at me when he proposed a toast. He raised his glass to Monique and her constantly failing fashion boutique instead of acknowledging my birthday. When the waiter brought out the beautiful custom cake I had purchased for myself, Harper demanded the first piece. I gently told her we needed to sing first. She glared at me, grabbed the edge of the heavy glass cake stand, and shoved it hard. The cake hit the pristine marble floor with a sickening splat. White frosting splattered all across my expensive shoes. "Eat it off the ground," Aunt Kiara Harper sneered, looking incredibly proud of herself. The entire dining room suddenly went dead silent for a split second before Trent let out a loud, booming laugh. "You people are always too sensitive," Trent said, waving his hand at me dismissively. "It is just cake, Kiara. Pick it up and stop making a big deal out of absolutely nothing." I looked directly at my mother, fully expecting her to discipline her grandchild, or at least reprimand her arrogant son-in-law. Instead, Vivian took a slow, deliberate sip of her red wine and sighed heavily. "Do not ruin the mood, Kiara. Just call the waiter over to clean up this mess so we can leave. Monique is incredibly stressed about her boutique right now, and we simply do not have the energy to coddle a 31-year-old single woman who cannot take a simple joke." The casual disrespect was suffocating, but it was nothing new. For my entire life, they treated me like the family outcast, while showering Monique with endless praise and financial bailouts. They thought I was just a low-level desk worker making a modest salary. They thought they held all the power. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or cause a public scene. I calmly wiped my hands on my linen napkin and reached into my designer clutch. I pulled out my American Express Centurion card, the heavy black titanium card that requires millions in annual spending just to receive a private invitation. I placed it on the small silver tray the waiter had nervously brought over to our table. "Pay the entire bill," I told the waiter calmly. "Include a 50% tip for the mess on the floor." Trent immediately stopped laughing. His eyes locked onto the black metal card, his jaw dropping slightly. He worked as a shady crypto broker in a highly volatile market, and he knew exactly what possessing that specific, incredibly exclusive card actually meant for his own precarious financial standing. Monique stared at me in total, absolute shock. Vivian and Desmond looked completely lost, unable to comprehend how their supposedly struggling daughter was casually dropping $5,000 on a single dinner. "Have a wonderful evening," I said, standing up and smoothing my skirt. I walked out of the restaurant, leaving them sitting in a heavy, stunned silence. I drove my luxury car back to my penthouse in Midtown Atlanta. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning panoramic view of the sparkling city skyline. It was a stark contrast to the modest lifestyle my family assumed I lived. They had no idea I was a highly successful hedge fund manager and a ruthless corporate liquidator. I had spent the last decade quietly building real generational wealth while they actively drowned in massive debt just to maintain a wealthy facade for their country club friends. The exact moment I walked through my front door, my phone began to buzz frantically. Our family group chat was going off. I expected questions about the black card or maybe a half-hearted apology for the cake incident. Instead, I received a long, aggressive text from Vivian. "You deeply embarrassed us tonight, Kiara. Walking out like that and trying to show off with whatever fake credit card you bought online was incredibly tacky and disrespectful. Trent is highly offended by your toxic attitude. We have decided that until you can learn how to properly respect your sister and your brother-in-law, we are choosing to sever all contact. Stay away from our house and stay away from our family forever." I watched the illuminated screen as a notification popped up showing that Monique had liked the message. They really thought this was a brutal punishment. They genuinely believed that cutting me off would leave me emotionally devastated, crying and begging for their forgiveness. What they did not know was the massive financial secret tying us together. 3 years ago, when Trent was facing serious federal prison time for a massive mortgage fraud scheme, Vivian and Desmond had come to my cramped apartment crying and begging on their knees. They pleaded with me to use my perfect credit score and spotless financial history to act as the primary guarantor for a massive business loan to bail Trent out of his legal trouble. I did it to save my parents from the overwhelming stress, but I secretly restructured the complex paperwork. I did not just co-sign the loan. I bought the entire debt portfolio from the bank through a private shell company. I legally owned the paper on Trent and his entire fraudulent operation. I sat on my plush velvet sofa, poured myself a glass of sparkling water, and typed my response. Message received loud and clear. Just so you are aware, I am executing the acceleration clause and removing my name from every single corporate loan tomorrow morning. Good luck keeping the house. I hit send. Then I turned off my cellular data connected to my secure home network and went to sleep peacefully. When I woke up the next morning and turned my cellular connection back on, my phone completely froze for a solid minute. The screen lit up with notification after notification. The group chat had devolved into absolute chaos. First, there were arrogant messages from Trent calling my bluff, then demanding messages from Monique ordering me to answer the phone, then frantic paragraphs from Desmond begging me to call them back immediately to discuss things reasonably. By midnight, the anger had clearly turned into sheer terror. The screen displayed exactly 126 missed calls from my parents and my brother-in-law. The grim reality of what my text meant had finally hit them. An acceleration clause meant the entire principal balance of the $1.5 million loan was due immediately in full. They did not have the money. They did not even have a fraction of the money. It was Monday morning. I walked into the grand marble lobby of my firm wearing a tailored white pantsuit and carrying my leather briefcase. My office occupied the entire top floor of a premium commercial building in the financial district. The pristine glass walls of my suite offered a perfect view of the city I had quietly conquered over the past decade. As a corporate liquidator, my job was to relentlessly dismantle failing businesses, recover hidden assets, and expose financial fraud. I was exceptionally good at my job. I sat down at my massive mahogany desk, opened my laptop, and pulled up the family loan documents. I sent a single encrypted email to the financial institution managing the trust. The acceleration clause was officially executed. The massive debt was officially called. Less than 2 hours later, the heavy glass doors of my reception area flew open with a violent crash. Trent barged into the suite, completely bypassing my terrified receptionist. His face was blotchy and red, sweating profusely in his cheap off-the-rack suit. He stormed down the hallway, ignoring the shocked stares of my analysts and accountants who watched the spectacle unfold. Kiara, he screamed, his voice echoing harshly off the glass walls. You think you can do this to me? He kicked the door to my personal office, completely disregarding the professional environment. Two tall, heavily built security guards immediately stepped out from the adjacent hallway, trailing right behind him, ready to intervene. I did not even look up from my dual monitors. I took a slow sip of my freshly brewed coffee and simply let him rant, knowing his anger was nothing more than the desperate flailing of a defeated man. You think you are so smart pulling this legal stunt? Trent yelled, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. You are going to call the bank right now and reverse this immediately. You hear me? Take this fake boss lady mask off right now. You are just the cleanup crew for this family. You are nothing but a diversity hire who got lucky in a bull market. The ugly microaggressions spilled out of him effortlessly, revealing the deep-seated prejudice he usually hid behind passive-aggressive jokes at the dinner table. He stepped closer to my desk, aggressively raising his hand as if he was going to strike me across the face. He never got the chance. In one incredibly swift motion, my lead security guard grabbed Trent by the shoulder, twisted his arm forcefully behind his back, and pinned him hard against the thick glass wall. Trent let out a loud yelp of sharp pain as his face smashed against the cold, transparent pane. Do not move, the guard warned, applying just enough physical pressure to make Trent whimper in submission. I slowly closed my laptop. I stood up gracefully, picking up a thick manila folder from the corner of my desk. I walked around to where Trent was securely pinned against the glass. He was breathing heavily, struggling uselessly against the guard iron grip, but entirely helpless. You always loved talking down to me, Trent, I said, my voice soft but razor sharp. You loved making me the butt of your cruel jokes at family dinners. You loved parading your fake wealth around town while secretly draining my parents' retirement funds to keep your pathetic crypto scams afloat. You honestly thought I was just some quiet little sister who would blindly sign papers and take your relentless disrespect forever. I tossed the heavy folder onto the small glass table next to him. Pages spilled out showing detailed financial forensic audits, transaction logs, and banking histories. I did not just call the loan, Trent, I explained, watching his eyes dart frantically toward the scattered papers. I spent the entire weekend compiling every single fraudulent transaction you made using the loan money I guaranteed. You used those funds to buy personal luxury vehicles, to fund Monique fake fashion boutique, and to pay off your massive offshore gambling debts. I forwarded the entire comprehensive dossier to the Internal Revenue Service at 8 o'clock this morning. Trent's face instantly drained of all color. The arrogant anger in his eyes was replaced by absolute gut-wrenching terror. The bank is the least of your problems right now. I continued, stepping back and signaling the guards to let him go. The guards released their tight grip, but stood firmly on either side of him, ready to strike. Trent stumbled forward, rubbing his bruised shoulder and breathing in ragged, panicked gasps. Your corporate accounts were just frozen by the IRS, brother-in-law, I said, walking back to my desk and sitting down comfortably in my leather chair. They are conducting a full criminal audit on your operations as we speak. I strongly suggest you call a very good federal defense attorney immediately because your fake boutique lifestyle is officially over. Now get out of my building before I have you arrested and charged for trespassing. Trent stood there, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly like a suffocating fish. The arrogant, confident man who had laughed at me being humiliated less than 48 hours ago was completely, utterly gone. He turned and stumbled out of the office, looking exactly like a broken man walking slowly to his own funeral. I watched him leave, picked up my coffee mug, and took a long, satisfying sip. The first domino had officially fallen, and the rest of the family fake empire was about to come crashing down right behind him. This story contains exactly 2,000 words. Let go of him, I told my security guard. The guard stepped back but stayed close enough to intervene if necessary. Trent stumbled forward, rubbing his shoulder and glaring at me with a mixture of raw hatred and disbelief. His carefully crafted persona of the wealthy white savior marrying into a prominent black family was unraveling right in front of my eyes. He straightened his cheap suit jacket and sneered. You are making a massive mistake, Kiara. You think freezing my accounts makes you a boss. I am the one who built this family. Before I came along, your parents were drowning in country club dues they could not afford. I elevated all of you. I brought real wealth into this family while you sat in your little office playing with spreadsheets. You people are always so eager to bite the hand that feeds you. It is pathetic. He spat the words out, his face twisting with that familiar underlying disgust he usually tried to mask with passive-aggressive jokes at the dinner table. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply reached into my bottom drawer and pulled out a thick red file, placing it gently on the center of my desk. I slid it toward him. You brought real wealth into this family, Trent. I stated, my tone completely conversational. I asked if that is what he calls federal mortgage fraud. Trent froze. His eyes darted to the red folder, but he refused to touch it. 3 years ago, you started that crypto advisory firm. I continued, leaning back in my chair. You promised your investors massive returns, but you were actually running a disorganized Ponzi scheme. When the market dipped, you panicked. You started forging property appraisals and falsifying loan documents to cover your massive shortfalls. You were looking at 20 years in federal prison for wire fraud and conspiracy. That is a lie, Trent stammered, though the sudden sweat on his forehead told a different story. I opened the folder for him. The top document was a signed confession from his former business partner, along with copies of the forged appraisals. I let him stare at it for a long moment before continuing. I asked him if he remembered the night before the federal indictments were supposed to be handed down. Vivian and Desmond showed up at my apartment at 2 in the morning. My mother was hyperventilating. My father was practically on his knees. They begged me to save their golden child's husband, because the scandal would have ruined their precious country club reputation. They begged me to use my spotless financial history and my firm capital to guarantee a bailout loan to pay off your defrauded investors before the feds got involved. They told you they secured a private investor to save your skin. Trent stared at me, his breathing shallow. He realized where this was going, but his pride refused to let him accept it. I was the private investor, Trent, I said softly. I used my own capital to quietly pay off the people you stole from. I kept you out of a federal penitentiary. But I am not an idiot. I did not just hand over the cash. I structured the bailout as a high-interest corporate loan, and I made myself the primary guarantor and sole debt holder. I own your firm. I own your assets. And as of this morning, when you decided my birthday was the perfect time to let your daughter humiliate me, and you decided to laugh about it, I decided I no longer wanted to be in the business of financing your fake life. You are bluffing, Trent said, but his voice was shaking. You would not destroy your own family. You are not my family, I replied. You are a bad investment, and I always liquidate bad investments. The Internal Revenue Service has the entire file now. Every offshore account you tried to hide, every fake tax return you filed. You should probably leave the building before the federal agents arrive to escort you out. Trent looked at the documents, then looked at me. The reality of his situation finally crushed the last remaining ounces of his arrogance. He turned around and practically ran out of my office, his heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway. He had barely made it to the elevator when my office phone buzzed. It was my receptionist downstairs in the main lobby. She sounded frantic. She told me my sister Monique was currently in the lobby causing a massive scene and refusing to leave until she saw me. I pulled up the lobby security camera feed on my right monitor and opened my social media accounts on my left monitor. Sure enough, Monique was standing in the center of the pristine marble lobby holding her phone up high. She was broadcasting live to her 70,000 followers, most of whom were bought or part of the superficial Atlanta socialite circle she desperately clung to. She was wearing designer sunglasses indoors, wiping away non-existent tears and performing the role of the heartbroken victim perfectly. I cannot believe my own sister would do something so evil, Monique cried into her phone camera. Her voice echoed faintly through the security feed while the audio played clearly through my computer speakers. We have done nothing but love Kiara. We have supported her. And because she is jealous of my marriage and jealous of my beautiful family, She is trying to illegally freeze my husband's business accounts. Please, everyone send prayers for our family. My sister has completely lost her mind. She is trying to destroy Black excellence because she is bitter and alone. I watched her perform this ridiculous spectacle. She was trying to control the narrative, trying to paint me as the jealous spinster sister who was lashing out for no reason. She wanted public sympathy to force me into backing down, to shame me into restoring their stolen funds. I did not feel angry. I felt incredibly focused. I opened my email client where a specific draft had been sitting in my outbox for 3 days. The recipient list included every single board member of the Atlanta Country Club, the organizers of the upcoming charity gala, and the prominent local politicians my parents constantly tried to court. Monique ran a nonprofit organization called the Black Youth Empowerment Fund. She attended luncheons and hosted lavish dinners, claiming to raise money for underprivileged girls in the city. My parents constantly bragged about her philanthropy, using it as proof of their superior moral standing. What no one knew was that I had run a quiet forensic audit on her nonprofit a month ago when I noticed discrepancies in the tax documents she had carelessly left at my house during a previous visit. The draft email contained a comprehensive 50-page audit report. It highlighted exactly where the donation money was actually going. It showed that less than 5% of the funds ever reached any community programs. The rest was systematically funneled through a series of shell companies directly into offshore gambling accounts tied to Trent. Monique was not a philanthropist. She was running a money laundering operation to feed her husband's severe sports betting addiction and maintain her own luxury shopping habits. I watched her on the monitor, still dabbing her eyes and telling her followers how much she loved her community and how she would not let my jealousy stop her charitable work. I moved my mouse over the send button. I did not hesitate. I clicked it. I kept my eyes on the live feed. Monique was right in the middle of a sentence about how forgiveness was important and how she hoped I would find peace. Then her phone buzzed loudly, disrupting the audio of her live stream. She ignored it and kept talking. 2 seconds later, it buzzed again. Then again. Then a constant stream of notifications started pouring in, rapidly overlapping each other and causing her phone to vibrate aggressively in her hand. I watched her expression change from fake sorrow to genuine confusion. She glanced at the top of her screen to read the incoming notifications. The transformation was instantaneous. The blood drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and terrified. Her mouth dropped open. The board members were reading the email. The country club elite were opening the attachments. They were seeing the bank statements, the wire transfers, the undeniable proof that she had been stealing their donation money to fund her lavish lifestyle. "Oh my God," Monique whispered, her voice trembling. She completely forgot she was still broadcasting to thousands of people. Her hands started shaking so violently, she almost dropped the device. One of the notifications must have been from the club president, because she let out a sharp gasp and quickly ended the live stream, the screen abruptly cutting to black on my monitor. I sat back in my chair and watched the lobby security camera. Monique was frantically scrolling through her phone, her face a mask of absolute horror. She started typing furiously, probably trying to formulate a lie, trying to explain away the forensic evidence. But numbers do not lie. I had provided bank routing numbers, internet protocol addresses, and matched the exact dates of the charity withdrawals to Trent's massive casino deposits. There was no spinning this. Her reputation, the only thing she valued more than her own child, was completely, entirely destroyed. She looked up at the security camera in the lobby, knowing I was watching her. She did not look arrogant anymore. She looked like a woman who realized she was standing in the middle of a burning building with no exits. She turned and ran out of the lobby, stumbling in her expensive heels, pushing past people on the sidewalk to escape. The silence in my office was beautiful. I closed the security feed and began reviewing a new acquisition portfolio for a client. I needed to get back to actual work. But I knew the fallout was far from over. I had just dismantled their financial security and their social standing in the span of 3 hours. The retaliation would be desperate. Right on cue, my personal cell phone began to ring. I checked the caller identification. It was Desmond, my father. I let it ring 4 times before answering, placing the phone on speaker and setting it on my desk. Kiara! My father's voice roared through the speaker so loudly it slightly distorted the audio. It was not the voice of a loving parent. It was the voice of a man whose carefully constructed kingdom was collapsing around him. He demanded to know if I had any idea what I had just done. He screamed that I just destroyed 30 years of this family reputation. His phone was ringing off the hook. The club president had just called to suspend their membership. He yelled that I exposed my own sister. I exposed a thief. I replied calmly, typing an email to my assistant. I told him if she did not want to be exposed, she should not have stolen charity funds to pay for her husband's bad bets. "You are sick," Kiara Desmond yelled, his voice cracking with rage. "You are a sick, bitter woman. We gave you life. We raised you. And you use your little accounting tricks to tear down everything we built. Monique is your sister. Trent is family. You protect family. You protect the family image," I corrected him, stopping my typing. "You do not protect me. You let them humiliate me for years. You stole my peace of mind to fund their delusions. I am simply bringing the accounts into balance. You think you won?" Desmond sneered, his breathing heavy and erratic. "You think because you have some paperwork you hold all the cards. I am not going to let you destroy Monique. I am calling my lawyers right now. I am suing you for ownership of your firm. We are going to take every single thing you have, Kiara. We will leave you with absolutely nothing." Less than an hour after Desmond screamed his threats over the phone, the heavy glass doors of my reception area swung open again. I watched through the transparent walls of my office as my parents marched into the lobby. They were accompanied by Arthur Sterling, the family attorney who had spent the last 2 decades helping them hide their financial mismanagement behind legal loopholes and aggressive posturing. Arthur was wearing a flashy pinstripe suit that looked too tight around his midsection, and he carried a thick leather briefcase that he clearly thought made him look intimidating. My mother, Vivian, strode right past my receptionist, with her nose in the air, her designer handbag clutched tightly against her side. She treated my office staff like they were invisible, stepping over the plush carpet as if it were dirty. Desmond walked right beside her, his face still flushed with anger, his fists clenched at his sides. They did not wait to be announced. They pushed open my office door and stood in front of my desk like a tribunal preparing to pass judgment on a disobedient child. I did not stand up to greet them. I simply folded my hands on top of my desk and waited for them to speak. Arthur Sterling puffed out his chest and slapped a thick stack of legal documents onto the center of my immaculate desk. He looked at me with a condescending smirk that he reserved for people he thought he could easily bully into submission. He cleared his throat loudly and announced that they were serving me with an emergency injunction. He stated that unless I immediately reversed the acceleration clause on Trent's loans and restored his corporate accounts, they were going to sue me for breach of fiduciary duty, intentional sabotage, and seize total control of my firm. He rattled off meaningless legal jargon, hoping to confuse me into signing his papers. I looked at the stack of papers and then looked calmly at my father. Desmond leaned forward, placing both hands heavy on my desk, trying to physically loom over me. He told me I had gone way too far this time. He said I was acting like an ungrateful, bitter child who was just jealous of her sister because Monique had a husband and a beautiful family. He demanded that I sign over 40% of my firm to Monique immediately as compensation for the severe emotional distress I had caused her this morning. He said that Trent was a good man who was just going through a rough patch in the market, and that family was supposed to protect each other, no matter what mistakes were made. Vivian crossed her arms over her chest and glared at me with absolute contempt. She told me I was a disgrace to the family name and an embarrassment to everything they stood for. She said if I did not sign the papers immediately and fix the mess I had made, they were going to officially write me out of their will. She proudly reminded me that the family estate in the country club community was worth over $3 million and filled with expensive art and imported furniture. She said they would leave every single penny of their massive wealth to Monique and Harper, and I would get absolutely nothing. She told me I would be dead to them, completely cut off from the generational wealth they had spent their entire lives building up for us. Desmond reminded me that they had graciously allowed me to attend their prestigious dinners and country club events, even though I always insisted on wearing boring clothes and refusing to network properly with the right kinds of people. Vivian added that they were willing to overlook my selfish behavior today if I just admitted I was wrong and apologized to Trent on my knees. She said if I transferred the funds to unfreeze his accounts right now, they would still let me come to Thanksgiving dinner and pretend this whole ugly incident never happened. The sheer arrogance of their demands was almost impressive. They were standing in my building surrounded by my highly paid employees, trying to treat me like a misbehaving teenager who needed a timeout. Arthur checked his gold watch and sighed loudly, saying he had a golf game to get to and that I was wasting his valuable time. He pushed the heavy silver pen closer to my hand and told me to be a good girl and do what my father said before things got ugly. I looked at the pen and then looked at Arthur. I slowly stood up from my chair, ignoring the legal documents completely. I walked over to the small espresso machine sitting on the credenza near the window overlooking the city skyline. The room was completely silent, except for the low hum of the machine as I pressed the button and watched the dark liquid pour into a small ceramic cup. I took my time. I breathed in the rich aroma of the coffee, letting them stand there in their awkward anger while they waited for my response. Vivian huffed loudly, complaining that I was being incredibly disrespectful by making them wait. She told Desmond to do something to make me listen. I picked up my espresso and turned to face them, leaning casually against the credenza with my ankles crossed. I did not address my parents at all. Instead, I looked directly at Arthur Sterling. I asked Arthur if he was the one who handled the financial restructuring for my parents 2 years ago. Arthur looked slightly confused by the sudden change in topic, but he nodded proudly, adjusting his silk tie. He boasted that he managed all of their high-level assets, estate planning, and wealth preservation strategies. I took a slow sip of my coffee and told him that he was doing a terrible job. Arthur turned red and opened his mouth to argue, but I kept speaking, cutting him off entirely. I asked him if it was his brilliant legal idea to take out a reverse mortgage on a $3 million property just to inject fast cash into a failing retail business that was bleeding money every single quarter. The color instantly drained from Vivian's face. Her hands dropped to her sides. Desmond took a sudden step back, his eyes darting toward the door as if he wanted to escape the room. They had managed to keep this a total secret from their entire social circle and their own lawyer for 2 full years. Arthur looked at my parents in utter confusion, his smug expression vanishing. He asked what reverse mortgage I was talking about. He said the estate was fully paid off and owned free and clear by the family trust, according to the documents they provided him. I smiled a slow, cold smile. I told Arthur that my parents had bypassed him entirely because they knew he would advise against such a catastrophic financial move. I explained that 2 years ago, when Monique was crying about her boutique going bankrupt because she spent all the inventory money on luxury vacations and designer handbags, my parents quietly went to a predatory subprime lender. They signed away the entire equity in their precious $3 million country club estate to secure a massive cash loan just to keep Monique's fake fashion empire afloat for a few more months. They were so obsessed with maintaining the image of Black excellence and having a daughter who was a successful entrepreneur that they literally gambled their entire home on her terrible business skills. I told Arthur that my parents did not have any generational wealth left to pass down to anyone. Their promised inheritance was completely worthless. The threat of writing me out of the will meant absolutely nothing because there was nothing left to inherit except a massive mountain of high-interest debt that was compounding every single day. Vivian started breathing heavily, gripping the edge of my desk for support, her knuckles turning white. She demanded to know how I found out about the loan. She said it was confidential banking information and that I was illegally hacking into their private affairs to ruin them. Desmond tried to recover his posture, clearing his throat and telling Arthur that it was just a temporary liquidity measure and that the house was perfectly fine. But Arthur was not an idiot. He was a sleazy lawyer, but he knew exactly how numbers worked. He looked at my parents with a mixture of profound betrayal and rising panic, realizing that his wealthiest clients were actually completely broke and that he was probably never going to get paid for the legal stunt he was currently pulling in my office. I took another sip of my espresso and told Arthur he really should run better financial background checks on his clients before storming into a corporate firm making baseless legal threats. I walked back to my desk and picked up the thick stack of papers Arthur had so aggressively thrown at me. I dropped them directly into the trash can next to my chair, the heavy thud echoing in the quiet room. Then I opened my top drawer and pulled out a single slim manila envelope. I handed it directly to Arthur. I told him he might want to review these documents before he talked about seizing my firm. Arthur opened the envelope with trembling hands. His eyes scanned the first page and his jaw dropped open. He flipped to the second page and he actually started sweating. Heavy beads of moisture formed on his forehead as he read through the legal transfer of ownership and the attached financial addendums. I explained the situation to him, using very simple words so my parents could understand the gravity of their reality. I told them that the subprime lender they used for the reverse mortgage had recently faced their own severe liquidity crisis in the market. That particular lender had to rapidly sell off chunks of their distressed debt portfolios to hedge funds and corporate liquidators just to survive the fiscal year. I looked at my father and told him that my firm specifically specializes in buying distressed debt from failing institutions. I bought the portfolio that contained their reverse mortgage for absolute pennies on the dollar about 6 months ago. Desmond looked like he had been physically struck by a heavy, blunt object. He asked what that meant, his voice suddenly small, raspy, and completely devoid of its usual booming authority. I told him it meant I was no longer just his disappointing, invisible daughter. I was his bank. I legally owned the mortgage on the $3 million estate they loved to brag about to all their friends. I held the exclusive deed to the property where they hosted their lavish fake charity dinners and high society gatherings. I turned to Vivian and told her that because she and Desmond had defaulted on their last 3 monthly payments, trying to scrape together cash to bail out Trent's gambling debts, they were currently in severe violation of the loan terms. I told them I had the legal right to begin formal foreclosure proceedings immediately, without any further notice. I told them they were going to lose the country club house, the luxury cars, the expensive country club membership, and every last ounce of their fake, prestigious reputation. Arthur dropped the papers on the desk as if they were literally burning his hands. He backed away from my parents like they were highly contagious. He told Desmond that he could not represent them anymore because they had lied to him about their core assets, and he was definitely not going to work for free on a losing case against a corporate liquidator. Arthur turned and practically ran out of my office, leaving his expensive gold pen sitting abandoned on my desk. The room fell dead silent again. All the arrogant, aggressive energy my parents had brought into the room was completely gone, evaporated into thin air. The harsh reality of their financial ruin was finally crushing them. Vivian started taking short, shallow breaths, her chest heaving. She looked down at the foreclosure warning attached to the back of the file on the desk. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and her knees completely gave out beneath her. She collapsed onto the plush carpet of my office in a dead faint, the designer handbag she loved so much tumbling out of her hands and spilling its contents everywhere. Desmond dropped to his knees beside her, but he did not even try to help her up or check if she was breathing. He was in a state of absolute panicked shock, staring blankly at the floor. His hands were shaking violently as he slowly looked up at me from his knees. His eyes were wild, desperate, and completely shattered. He lost control of his mental filter, completely blurting out the first thing that came to his panicked mind. "I told you, Vivian!" he screamed at his unconscious wife, his voice echoing horribly off the glass walls of my office. "I told you this would happen. I told you we should not have stolen her college fund to buy Monique that Mercedes when she was 18. We should never have touched Kiara's money." The heavy air in my office felt thick enough to choke on. Desmond. My father remained on his knees on the plush carpet, sobbing uncontrollably with his face buried in his hands. The echo of his confession still bounced off the pristine glass walls of my high-rise suite. He had just blurted out the darkest secret they had kept hidden from me for over a decade. He had just admitted that they stole my college savings to buy my sister Monique a luxury Mercedes when she turned 18. They had watched me struggle through my entire young adult life. They watched me work grueling night shifts at a greasy diner smelling like old frying oil while I tried to study for my advanced finance exams. They let me take out massive student loans with predatory interest rates, telling me with straight faces that the volatile stock market had wiped out the accounts my grandparents had lovingly set up for me. All those years of fake sympathy, all those times they told me that financial struggle builds character were nothing but calculated lies to cover up their shameless theft. Vivian, who had fainted from the shock of realizing I now owned the mortgage to their $3 million estate, began to stir on the floor. Her designer handbag lay spilled next to her, the expensive cosmetics and gold credit cards scattered across my custom rug. She blinked her eyes open and pushed herself up onto her elbows, her perfectly styled hair now frizzy and disheveled from the fall. It took her a few seconds to process where she was and what had just happened. When her confused gaze landed on Desmond kneeling and weeping, the memory of his loud confession hit her like a physical blow. The wealthy, poised country club matriarch completely vanished in an instant. Vivian scrambled to her feet, letting out a guttural scream of pure, unchecked rage. She lunged at her husband, swinging her manicured hands and slapping him hard across his shoulders and chest. She screamed that he was an absolute fool for opening his mouth. She demanded to know why he would confess to a serious financial crime in front of the very daughter they had stolen from. Desmond tried to shield his face from her blows, crying out that the pressure was too much, and that they were going to lose the house anyway, so what did it matter anymore? Vivian did not care about his excuses. She grabbed the lapels of his expensive custom suit and shook him violently. She yelled that they could have denied everything, they could have played it off as a misunderstanding or a bad investment, but his weak stomach had just handed me the rope to hang them both in a court of law. I stood behind my mahogany desk watching my parents physically attack each other like cornered animals. The flawless image of affluent black excellence they projected to the world was shattering into a million sharp pieces right in front of my eyes. Vivian turned her furious glare toward me, desperately trying to salvage the unsalvageable situation. She pointed a shaking finger at my face and told me that Desmond was just confused from the stress of my cruel legal threats. She told me I was hallucinating if I thought they ever touched my money, and that I was an ungrateful, spiteful child for even entertaining the thought that my own parents would rob me. I did not blink. I simply stared at her with eyes as cold as ice, feeling absolutely nothing for the woman who birthed me. I told her that the time for gaslighting and lying was over, and that I was going to initiate the foreclosure on their estate by the end of the business day. The terrifying reality of living on the street finally silenced her desperate screams. She backed away from me, her chest heaving heavily as the absolute power I held over their entire future finally sank in. Desmond realized in that terrifying moment that Vivian could not save them, and his own lies could no longer protect his lifestyle. He looked at my cold expression and realized I was fully prepared to throw them out of their mansion and leave them with absolutely nothing. The instinct for pure self-preservation kicked in, overriding any remaining loyalty he had to his family or his favorite child. He scrambled up from the floor, wiping his tear-stained face with the back of his trembling hand. He held his hands up in a placating gesture, backing away from his furious wife and turning his attention solely to me. He told me to wait and begged me not to execute the foreclosure documents. He said he was not the only one who had stolen from me. He pointed a shaking finger toward the lobby doors and said that Monique was the real criminal in the family and that she was the one I should be punishing. Vivian gasped loudly and told him to shut his mouth immediately, but Desmond was entirely desperate now. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a small silver flash drive, holding it out to me like a desperate peace offering. His voice cracked as he explained exactly what was on the drive. When our paternal grandmother passed away, she had set up a blind trust, intended to be split equally between Monique and me upon our 25th birthdays. I had never seen a single penny of it. My parents had explicitly told me the trust was completely depleted, paying for our grandmother's expensive end-of-life medical care and hospice facilities. Desmond confessed right then and there that the trust had actually been fully funded with hundreds of thousands of dollars. But Monique had forged my signature on the legal release documents. She had completely drained my half of the inheritance to fund her lavish destination, weddings, her luxury cars, and the initial startup costs for her continuously failing fashion boutique. Desmond admitted that he and Vivian had found out about the forgery a month after it happened. Instead of reporting it to the authorities and forcing their golden child to face federal forgery and wire fraud charges, they decided to actively cover it up. They hired private accountants to alter family financial records, to hide the missing funds, and spent years lying to my face about the fake medical bills. Desmond practically shoved the silver flash drive across my desk, begging me to take it. He said the drive contained the original unedited banking logs, the forged signature documents, and the email trails proving Monique's guilt. He pleaded with me to take the house back to keep my firm and to put all the legal blame entirely on Monique. He said they were just trying to protect their eldest daughter from going to federal prison, but she was a toxic parasite who had ruined them all and dragged them down with her. The massive magnitude of the betrayal settled over me like a heavy lead blanket. Not only had my parents stolen my college tuition, but my sister had stolen my actual inheritance, and my parents had actively shielded her from the law. They had happily sacrificed my entire financial future just to maintain Monique's fake socialite lifestyle and their country club image. I slowly reached out and took the silver flash drive from his trembling hand, feeling a dark sense of vindication wash over me. Just as my fingers closed around the cold metal of the drive, the heavy glass doors of my office suite violently crashed open. Monique stormed into the room, her eyes wild and her expensive designer dress rumpled from her frantic escape earlier. Trent dragged his feet right behind her, looking thoroughly defeated and physically sick. He had apparently been hiding in the parking garage, too terrified of the federal government to leave the premises without his wife. Monique had stormed back upstairs to demand that our parents force me to retract the country club emails, but she had walked in just in time to hear Desmond offer her up to the slaughter to save his own skin. She stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the flash drive in my hand and the desperate pleading look on our father's face. The realization that Desmond had just handed me the hard evidence to send her to federal prison snapped something deep inside her brain. Monique went absolutely feral. She let out a piercing animalistic shriek and threw her heavy handbag directly at Desmond, hitting him square in the chest. She screamed that he was a traitor, a coward, and a pathetic excuse for a father. She yelled that she was not going down alone for trying to survive in a family built entirely on lies and deceit. If Desmond was willing to ruin her to save his own house, she was going to burn his entire secret life to the ground, right here and now. Monique turned her furious, unhinged gaze toward Vivian, who was still trying to process the absolute chaos erupting around her. Monique laughed a harsh, manic sound that chilled the room. She asked Vivian if she wanted to know where the rest of the family business equity really went over the last decade, because it certainly was not just spent on bailing out her boutique. Monique pointed an accusing finger at Desmond and announced to the room that our perfect wealthy father had a secret second family living in Florida. She revealed that Desmond had been maintaining a much younger mistress in Miami for the past 12 years, and he actually had 2 younger children with her. The room felt like the oxygen had been instantly sucked out by a vacuum. Vivian stood completely paralyzed, her eyes wide with unadulterated shock as Monique's cruel words hung in the stale air. Monique relentlessly detailed how Desmond had used the supposedly failing family business accounts to buy a massive waterfront home in Miami and pay for expensive private school tuition for his illegitimate children while telling Vivian they needed to cut back on expenses. The black excellence family image, the flawless marriage, the high society country club status. It was all a complete sickening sham built on infidelity and stolen money. Vivian let out a sound that was half heartbroken sob and half furious scream. Her entire identity and life work had just been brutally eviscerated by her own daughter and husband. She lunged at Desmond with pure, murderous intent, her hands hooking into his shirt collar as she threw him backward against the thick glass wall. The professional office instantly devolved into an absolute war zone. My parents were screaming and tearing at each other with unbridled hatred, while Monique yelled profanities at them both, crying hysterically about her ruined life and the impending legal charges. Trent stood by the door looking pale and pathetic, trying to make himself as small as possible to avoid the intense crossfire of the family he had married into. I stood silently behind my desk, watching the empire of lies completely implode right in my lobby. The people who had tortured me, alienated me, and stolen from me were now destroying each other without me having to lift a single finger to help them. Then the shrill wail of police sirens pierced through the thick glass windows of my high-rise office, cutting through the sounds of the screaming. The sound grew louder and louder, until red and blue lights began flashing rapidly against the surrounding buildings, illuminating the room in harsh colors. Heavy, confident footsteps echoed down the hallway outside my suite. The office doors swung wide open, and the local sheriff walked into the room flanked by two armed deputies. The screaming immediately stopped as the family turned to face the uniformed officers. Vivian and Desmond froze their hands, still gripping each other's torn clothes. Monique wiped her ruined makeup from her face and smirked, looking directly at me, clearly believing my parents had finally called the police to arrest me for some fabricated corporate crime or extortion. But the sheriff did not even look at me. He did not look at Monique either. He walked right past my stunned parents and grabbed Trent firmly by his arm. He pulled out a folded warrant and announced in a booming voice that Trent was under arrest. The sheriff read Trent his Miranda rights while the deputies aggressively clicked the heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. The metallic sound echoed sharply against the glass walls of my office suite. Trent did not fight back. He did not shout or demand his lawyer. He just whimpered like a scared child, his knees buckling slightly under his own weight as the reality of federal prison finally sank into his privileged brain. Monique lunged forward, trying to grab the sheriff by his uniform shirt, but a deputy quickly stepped in her path, blocking her with a stern physical warning. She screamed at them, asking if they knew who she was, and threatening to sue the entire police department for ruining her perfectly curated life. She yelled that they were making a terrible mistake and that her husband was a respected wealth manager. The sheriff simply ignored her theatrics. He stated clearly that Trent was being indicted on 47 counts of federal wire fraud and massive federal tax evasion. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Wire fraud and tax evasion. The federal government does not play around with stolen money. My father Desmond, who had just been exposed for his secret second family in Florida, was still sitting on the floor, completely paralyzed by the sheer volume of destruction happening all at once. Vivian was staring blankly at the wall, her brain seemingly unable to process another catastrophic blow to her high society image. Her perfect world was burning down to the studs. The deputies dragged Trent out of my office suite, his expensive leather shoes dragging across the marble floor. Monique chased after them all the way to the elevator, screaming his name, until the metal doors closed and took him away to a federal holding cell. The silence that fell over my office was thick and heavy. Monique slowly walked back into my suite, her face a mess of ruined mascara and absolute desperation. The fake socialite mask had completely melted away, leaving only a terrified woman who suddenly realized she had no actual money of her own. She looked at our parents, who were completely broken and useless. Then she turned her wild eyes toward me. She marched right up to my desk, slamming her hands down on the polished wood. She demanded that I call my bank immediately. She screamed that Trent's bail was going to be set at $500,000, and since I was the one who froze their accounts, it was my responsibility to write the check. She told me I owed her this because she was my older sister, and family always bails family out of trouble. She yelled that if Trent spent a single night in a federal holding facility, his life would be ruined, and it would be entirely my fault. She tried to glare at me with that same entitled superiority she had used my entire life, but she possessed zero leverage. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or offer her a single ounce of pity. I slowly reached over to the credenza and picked up the espresso I had poured earlier. The ceramic cup was still warm against my palms. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the rich, bitter taste wash over my tongue, while she stood there panting and waiting for me to save her. I looked directly into my sister's manic, tear-filled eyes. I told her very calmly that I do not finance felons. The word struck her like a physical blow. She recoiled, gasping for air, as if I had literally knocked the wind out of her lungs. I reminded her that she was the one who forged my signature to drain our grandmother's blind trust. I told her she should probably start figuring out how to pawn her designer handbags and sell her fake jewelry because she was going to need every single penny to afford a decent criminal defense attorney. I told her that the federal government was already dismantling her fraudulent boutique and that $500,000 was just a drop in the bucket compared to the restitution she and Trent were going to owe the Internal Revenue Service. Monique started hyperventilating, her hands clutching her chest as the delusional bubble she had lived in for her entire adult life finally violently burst. She looked at Vivian and Desmond, begging them to force me to help her, but they just looked away, completely consumed by their own impending ruin. I set my espresso cup down and decided it was time to put the final nail in the coffin of their fake black excellence empire. I looked at Vivian, who was still shivering on the floor, clutching her spilled designer bag, and Desmond, who looked like a hollow shell of a man staring blankly at his own hands. I told them they really should have vetted the white savior they welcomed into their family with open arms. I walked around my desk and picked up the red folder that Trent had refused to touch earlier. I pulled out a thick stack of federal loan applications and tossed them onto the floor right between my parents. The pages scattered across the carpet, exposing years of systemic financial abuse. I told them to read the paperwork if they wanted to understand exactly who they had let into their home. I explained that Trent despised everything about our culture. He constantly made microaggressions and passive-aggressive jokes about our family at the dinner table, and my parents had simply laughed along because they thought his proximity to whiteness gave them elevated social status. They thought having a white son-in-law working in finance legitimized their country club dreams. But Trent did not marry Monique out of love or respect. He married her because she was the perfect, useful idiot for his criminal enterprise. I pointed to the documents on the floor and explained that Trent had used Monique's failing boutique to apply for massive government Paycheck Protection Program loans during the economic crisis. He explicitly used her status as a minority female business owner to get priority approval for millions of dollars in federal relief funds. The government issued the money to help Black-owned businesses survive the financial downturn, but Trent immediately funneled every single cent into his offshore crypto accounts and his illegal sports betting syndicates. He used the very culture he privately mocked to steal millions from the federal government while simultaneously destroying his wife's credit and putting her name on federal fraud documents. Vivian let out a horrified sob, finally understanding the absolute depth of her son-in-law's depravity. Desmond picked up one of the applications with trembling fingers and stared at the forged signatures and the fake employee payrolls Trent had invented to secure the funds. They had paraded Trent around their country club, pretending he was a brilliant financial mastermind, when in reality he was just a parasitic racist fraud who used their daughter's identity to commit massive federal embezzlement. I told them that the feds were going to seize everything tied to the boutique, including the house they had reverse mortgaged to fund it. Their desperate attempt to buy their way into elite high society had literally handed a criminal the keys to their entire kingdom. They had sold their souls and their actual daughter's future just to impress country club friends who were currently deleting their phone numbers. I told them to get out of my office before I had security forcibly remove them. Desmond slowly helped Vivian to her feet, both of them looking completely aged and broken by the weight of their own arrogance. They stumbled out of the glass doors without saying a single word, completely shattered by the reality of their toxic choices. Monique just stood there, trembling silently, finally understanding that she was going to lose absolutely everything she thought defined her. Exactly 48 hours later, the inevitable reality of federal indictments finally hit the family. The authorities officially seized all of Trent's remaining assets, and the bank initiated immediate foreclosure proceedings on Monique's lavish suburban mansion. She had zero savings, zero legal income, and her husband was sitting in a federal holding facility with his bail unequivocally denied due to being a severe flight risk. Her beloved fashion boutique was boarded up tightly with massive federal seizure notices plastered all over the pink front doors. My parents were in absolutely no position to help her, as they were currently dealing with their own aggressive foreclosure notices and the explosive fallout of Desmond's secret second family in Florida. Vivian had locked herself in a cheap motel room, refusing to speak to anyone, and Desmond was hiding from his creditors and his angry mistress. Monique was entirely out of options. Her wealthy socialite friends had abandoned her the second the news of the embezzlement hit the local blogs. So she resorted to the only tactic she had left, which was extreme emotional manipulation. I was sitting in the private residence lounge of my luxury midtown condo building, enjoying a quiet Saturday morning, reading financial reports, and drinking green tea. My building has intense security with a private concierge and restricted elevator access, so I felt completely insulated from the chaos consuming my former family. But Monique was nothing if not desperate. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from the front desk concierge. He sounded incredibly uncomfortable and apologetic as he spoke. He told me that my sister was in the main lobby and she was causing a massive scene. He said she had a young child with her and they were disturbing the other high-net-worth residents by crying loudly near the elevators. I sighed, closed my laptop, and took the private elevator down to the ground floor, fully prepared to have security physically escort her off the premises. When the elevator doors chimed open, the sight in the grand marble lobby was absolutely pathetic. Monique was wearing unwashed sweatpants and an oversized hoodie, a stark contrast to the designer gowns she usually paraded around in at her fake charity galas. Her hair was a messy knot, and she looked completely unhinged, shifting her weight nervously. But the most manipulative part of her pathetic display was her 10-year-old daughter Harper. The same arrogant little girl who had proudly smashed my expensive custom birthday cake onto the steakhouse floor less than a week ago was now standing by the reception desk, looking terrified and confused. Monique saw me step out of the elevator and immediately grabbed Harper by the shoulders, dragging her forward across the polished floor. Several affluent residents were pausing by the mailroom, watching the spectacle unfold with polite disgust and whispered comments. Monique ignored them completely, focusing her wild, desperate eyes solely on me. She pushed Harper forward, forcing the child to stumble awkwardly toward my feet. Monique had clearly coached the little girl on exactly what to do, because Harper immediately dropped to her knees on the cold, hard marble floor. The little girl looked up at me with tears streaming down her face, her lower lip trembling violently as she played the role of the innocent victim perfectly. She clasped her small hands together in a begging motion while Monique stood behind her, nodding encouragingly, with a sick, twisted expression on her face. Harper let out a loud, dramatic sob that echoed through the massive lobby, ensuring every single person in the vicinity was watching us and waiting to see what I would do. She looked directly into my eyes and recited the exact manipulative script her mother had explicitly given her to say. Auntie Kiara, please save my daddy. Save my... The words hung in the grand marble lobby, heavy with calculated manipulation. Harper was kneeling on the cold floor, her small hands clasped together, her face stained with dramatic tears. She was 10 years old, but she had already been thoroughly trained in the family business of emotional extortion. Monique stood right behind her daughter, her hands resting on Harper's shaking shoulders, looking at me with an expression that falsely conveyed the tragic desperation of a shattered mother. The wealthy residents passing by paused their conversations, casting judgmental glances in my direction. They saw a heartless, wealthy woman looking down at a weeping child and a desperate mother. It was exactly the scene Monique wanted to paint. She thought the public pressure of a high-end luxury building would force my hand. She thought I would crumble at the sight of my niece crying for her father and immediately transfer the $500,000 just to make the embarrassing spectacle stop. I looked down at Harper. I remembered how this exact same little girl had proudly shoved my expensive custom birthday cake onto the steakhouse floor just a few days ago, laughing while her father mocked me. But looking at her now, I did not see the arrogant brat from the restaurant. I saw a child being actively weaponized by a mother who possessed absolutely zero moral boundaries. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not reach for my checkbook. Instead, I calmly unlocked the clasp of the leather briefcase I had brought down with me from my penthouse. I reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound by a heavy blue clip. I knelt down so I was at eye level with Harper, ignoring Monique's expectant, greedy stare. I spoke to Harper in a soft but firm voice, telling her that she was going to be okay, and that her education would never be compromised by the terrible choices her parents had made. I stood back up and handed the thick stack of papers directly to Monique. Monique snatched them from my hand eagerly, her eyes scanning the first page, anticipating a massive cash settlement or a blank check for Trent's bail. But her eager expression quickly morphed into profound confusion as she read the legal header. I told Monique that I had anticipated she would try to use her daughter as a bargaining chip the second the federal indictments came down. So I spent the previous evening having my legal team draft an irrevocable educational trust entirely in Harper's name. I explained the terms of the trust very slowly and clearly, so the lingering residents in the lobby could hear exactly how generous I was actually being. I told her that the trust was fully funded with enough capital to cover 100% of Harper's private school tuition through the 12th grade. It also included a locked college fund that would pay for a 4-year degree at any university she chose. Harper's entire academic future was completely secure. She would never have to worry about student loans or missing out on a premium education because of her father's federal wire fraud charges. Monique stared at the papers, her hands beginning to tremble slightly as she flipped through the pages, searching for the catch. I smiled a very cold, calculating smile and told her exactly what the catch was. The trust was completely bulletproof. I had explicitly structured the legal framework so that Monique and Trent could not touch a single solitary penny of the money. The funds would be dispersed directly from my wealth management firm, strictly to the educational institutions Harper attended. There would be no cash payouts. There would be no liquid assets transferred to Monique's personal accounts. There would be no living stipends, no housing allowances, and absolutely no money allocated for federal bail bonds or high-priced criminal defense attorneys. I was saving my niece, but I was legally starving my sister. Monique stared at the blue ink on the final page of the trust document, her brain struggling to process the reality of the situation. She flipped back to the first page, then to the third, searching frantically for a loophole, a cash provision, anything she could exploit. When she finally realized that the document in her hands was completely useless for her immediate desperate needs, the fragile mask of the heartbroken mother completely evaporated. The fake tears stopped instantly. The dramatic slump of her shoulders turned into a rigid, aggressive posture. She dropped the legal documents onto the marble floor, letting them scatter across the lobby like worthless trash. She stepped over them and marched right up to my face, her features contorting into an ugly snarl of pure, unadulterated, selfish rage. "You think I care about this brat's tuition?" Monique screamed, her voice echoing harshly off the high ceilings of the lobby. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my chest, completely dropping the innocent victim act. "I do not care about some stupid private school in 10 years, Kiara. I am losing my house. The federal government seized my boutique. My husband's accounts are frozen, and he is sitting in a cage like an animal. I need $500,000 in liquid cash for Trent's criminal defense and his bail right now. I do not need you paying for spelling tests and math tutors, you selfish, arrogant witch." The lobby went dead silent. The few residents who had been whispering sympathetically about the crying child were now staring at Monique in absolute horror. She had just screamed at the top of her lungs that she did not care about her own daughter's future. But the most devastating reaction did not come from the wealthy bystanders. It came from the floor. Harper was still kneeling on the marble, her hands resting loosely in her lap. The fake dramatic tears she had been coached to cry had stopped, but genuine raw tears were now welling up in her eyes. She stared up at her mother, her young face crumbling in real time as the devastating truth fractured her entire world. She had always been the golden child, the pampered princess who thought her parents adored her above everything else. But in that single defining moment of selfish panic, Monique had accidentally ripped the curtain away. Harper heard her mother explicitly call her a brat. She heard her mother prioritize Trent's criminal defense over her own well-being and education. She realized with gut-wrenching clarity that she was nothing more than a prop, an emotional human shield her mother had dragged into this lobby solely to extract money from an aunt they all despised. Harper let out a small, broken whimper, wrapping her arms around her own small body and shrinking away from her mother. The psychological damage inflicted in those few seconds was catastrophic. The arrogant little girl who had thrown my cake was gone, replaced by a traumatized child who suddenly realized her mother did not actually love her at all. I looked from the devastated child on the floor back to the monster standing in front of me. I told Monique she was the most pathetic excuse for a mother I had ever seen, and that her true colors were finally on full display for everyone to witness. The absolute truth of my words pushed Monique completely over the edge. The realization that her manipulation had failed her social standing was ruined, and she had just permanently traumatized her only child in front of a dozen wealthy witnesses, shattered the final thread of her sanity. She let out a guttural shriek of raw fury and lunged directly at me. Her hands reached out like claws aiming straight for my face, her long acrylic nails prepared to tear my skin. I did not even have time to step back, but I did not need to. Before Monique could even lay a single finger on my suit, my building security team descended upon her with ruthless professional efficiency. The head concierge, who had been watching the entire exchange closely, signaled the guards the moment Monique's voice escalated. Two heavily built security guards tackled her from the side, grabbing her arms and forcing them behind her back. Monique screamed and thrashed wildly, her expensive heels slipping on the marble floor as they pinned her firmly against the reception desk. She kicked and spat completely, losing any remaining shred of dignity as the guards quickly radioed for the police to report an assault in progress. Harper scrambled backward, crying hysterically, and burying her face in her hands, terrified by the violent spectacle of her mother being subdued by strange men. Exactly at that chaotic moment, the glass revolving doors of the building lobby slowly pushed open. My mother, Vivian, and my father, Desmond, walked in, looking exhausted and frantic. They had apparently been desperately searching for Monique after she abandoned them at the motel to try her luck with me. They stopped dead in their tracks, their eyes wide with absolute horror as they took in the disastrous scene unfolding in the grand lobby. Vivian watched her beautiful golden child, The daughter she had sacrificed everything to elevate being physically restrained by security guards while screaming obscenities like a common criminal. Her perfectly manicured world, the delusion of upper-class black excellence she had maintained through decades of lies and theft, was finally permanently destroyed. She saw me standing calmly nearby, completely untouched, while her beloved daughter was reduced to a violent spectacle. The heavy glass doors opened again, and two uniformed police officers rushed in, responding to the concierge's emergency call. They took one look at the struggling woman and immediately pulled out their metal handcuffs, clicking them securely around Monique's wrists. Vivian let out a strangled, gasping sound. She raised a trembling hand to her chest, gripping the fabric of her expensive blouse as her face turned a terrifying shade of gray. The overwhelming shock of seeing her favorite child being arrested right in front of her, combined with the massive stress of their impending foreclosure and Desmond's secret second family, was simply too much for her heart to bear. Vivian collapsed. Her knees buckled instantly, and she hit the hard marble floor with a sickening thud, completely unresponsive. Desmond screamed her name, dropping to his knees beside her and frantically shaking her shoulders, but Vivian did not move. Her lips were turning blue, and her breathing had completely stopped. The lobby erupted into absolute chaos as the police officers immediately called for an emergency medical unit. Monique stopped thrashing, staring in stunned silence as the paramedics rushed into the building just minutes later. They pushed Desmond aside and immediately began performing chest compressions on Vivian right there on the lobby floor. They loaded her limp body onto a stretcher, sliding an oxygen mask over her face, and sprinting back out the glass doors toward the waiting ambulance with its sirens wailing loudly. The police hauled a sobbing, handcuffed Monique out to a patrol car, completely ignoring her pleas to go with her mother. I stood perfectly still, watching the flashing red and blue lights reflect against the glass windows of my building. My phone suddenly began to vibrate in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw Desmond's name flashing on the screen. He must have been riding in the back of the ambulance, calling me in a state of absolute panicked grief. I swiped the screen to answer and brought the phone to my ear. Desmond's voice was hoarse and cracking with sheer terror and unbridled rage, screaming over the loud wail of the ambulance sirens. He yelled that if my mother died tonight, it was going to be my fault, and that her blood would be permanently on my hands. The drive to the downtown hospital was a blur of neon city lights, reflecting off my windshield, and the steady, rhythmic hum of my car engine cutting through the dark evening. Desmond's shrieking voice still echoed in my ears, blaming me for a medical crisis I had absolutely no hand in creating, and accusing me of having my own mother's blood on my hands. I did not speed or rush through traffic. I drove with the same cold, calculating precision I used to dismantle their fake financial empire earlier that afternoon. I handed my keys to the hospital valet, smoothing out the wrinkles in my tailored suit jacket before walking through the automatic sliding doors of the emergency room. The harsh fluorescent lighting of the hospital was a stark contrast to the dark, humid Atlanta night outside. The waiting area was packed with tired, sick people, but it was entirely impossible to miss my family. They had commandeered the entire center section of the waiting room, turning a public hospital triage area into their own private theater stage for an audience of captive strangers. Desmond was pacing back and forth across the cheap linoleum floor, with his head buried in his hands, groaning loudly enough for every triage nurse behind the safety glass to hear his performance. My Aunt Sherry and Uncle Marcus, who had completely ignored my existence for the last 10 years, because my modest desk job did not fit their affluent aesthetic, were clutching each other on plastic chairs and weeping openly. The moment Desmond saw me walking calmly toward them, he stopped pacing and pointed a shaking finger directly at my chest. He announced to the entire waiting room that the prodigal daughter had finally arrived after putting her own mother on her deathbed. He did not lower his booming voice. He wanted an audience to witness his righteous paternal anger. He stormed over to me, grabbing my upper arm so tightly, his fingers dug painfully into my skin through my jacket sleeve. He dragged me toward the corner of the waiting area, his breath smelling like stale coffee and sheer panic. He told me that Vivian was clinging to life by a thread in the intensive care unit, and that the doctors were running emergency tests to see if her heart would even survive the night. He said her heart had simply given out under the crushing weight of my cruel betrayal and the shock of seeing Monique arrested like a common street criminal. Aunt Sherry chimed in, wiping her perfectly dry eyes with a crumpled tissue. She stepped directly into my personal space and told me I should be utterly ashamed of myself for choosing money over my own flesh and blood. She said, "If Vivian died tonight, I would have to live with the heavy guilt for the rest of my miserable, lonely life, and that the entire family would disown me forever." Desmond leaned in close, his voice dropping to a desperate, frantic whisper that was meant only for my ears. He told me there was only one way to fix this disaster and save her life. He demanded that I pull out my phone right then and there and send a formal email to my legal team, canceling the foreclosure on their estate and dropping the reverse mortgage acceleration. He said if Vivian woke up and heard the news that her beautiful home was safe and her country club status was restored, the sheer relief might be the only thing strong enough to pull her back from the brink of death. He was literally using his supposedly dying wife as a bargaining chip to save his precious country club mansion. I looked at the ring of extended family members surrounding me, their faces twisted in performative sorrow, waiting eagerly for me to break down, crying and surrender my firm to save the family matriarch. They genuinely believed I was still the same fragile, invisible girl who would do absolutely anything to earn their love and approval. I gently but firmly pulled my arm out of my father's tight grip. I smoothed the fabric of my jacket and told him I was not going to cancel a single legal proceeding based on a cheap guilt trip in a public hospital lobby. I told him I was going to speak to the attending doctor because, unlike the rest of the people in this room, I preferred dealing with actual facts instead of amateur theatrics. Desmond turned a deep shade of purple, with rage sputtering that I was a heartless monster. But I simply turned my back on him and walked straight toward the reception desk, leaving their pathetic performance entirely behind me. I approached the thick safety glass of the triage desk and calmly handed my driver's license to the exhausted nurse on duty. I informed her that my name was Kiara, and I was the primary medical proxy and sole insurance holder for Vivian. Years ago, when my parents realized their massive debt was beginning to crush them, and they could no longer afford their luxury lifestyle, they quietly transferred all of their premium healthcare policies under my corporate firm umbrella. They did it because I was the only one in the family with the actual financial stability to maintain the exorbitant monthly premiums without defaulting. They had willingly signed away their medical privacy rights and given me full proxy control just to keep their platinum-tier health coverage intact. The nurse typed my name into her computer system, and her demeanor instantly shifted from guarded annoyance to professional courtesy. She nodded and told me the attending ER physician was already waiting to speak with the primary policyholder in private. She pressed a button under her desk, buzzing me through the secure double doors and leaving my father and the rest of his dramatic audience stranded helplessly in the waiting room. A tall doctor in dark blue scrubs met me in the quiet, sterile hallway outside the observation rooms. He carried a digital tablet in his hand and looked profoundly irritated rather than sympathetic. He asked if I was the daughter holding the medical proxy, and I confirmed that I was. I braced my shoulders, expecting to hear a grim medical update about blocked arteries, emergency bypass surgery, or a massive stroke caused by the intense stress of the afternoon. Instead, the doctor let out a long, heavy sigh and asked me to follow him into an empty consultation room far away from the bustling nurses' station. He closed the door behind us, sealing us in a quiet, private space. The heavy silence of the room felt thick with anticipation, but the doctor did not offer any comforting words. He tapped the screen of his tablet, pulled up a medical chart, and bluntly informed me that my mother was not having a heart attack. He told me she was not dying. She was not in critical condition, and her heart was structurally as healthy as a horse. I stood there processing the words, staring at him in complete silence, while the gravity of the situation shifted. I asked him why she had collapsed in my lobby, unable to breathe, and turning a terrifying shade of gray before the ambulance arrived. The doctor crossed his arms over his chest and explained the results of the rapid blood toxicology report they had just processed through the hospital lab. He told me they found a massive localized dose of prescription stimulants in her system. Specifically, she had ingested a high-grade amphetamine, usually prescribed for severe attention deficit disorders, which she absolutely did not have a medical prescription for. He explained that taking such a massive unprescribed dose all at once would artificially skyrocket her heart rate, induce intense hyperventilation, cause severe sweating, and mimic the exact physical symptoms of a massive cardiac event without actually causing any permanent damage to the heart muscle. She had completely faked it. My mother had deliberately swallowed a handful of stolen stimulants right before walking into my office building, knowing exactly what the severe physical reaction would look like. She had planned the entire medical emergency as a calculated theatrical performance to force me into a corner and manipulate me into dropping the foreclosure on their estate. She was willing to waste emergency hospital resources, terrify bystanders, and fake her own death just to keep her country club membership and her stolen mansion. The doctor told me they had administered a mild sedative to counteract the amphetamines and that she was currently resting comfortably in Observation Room 4 with perfectly normal vital signs. He warned me that the hospital would be billing my premium insurance for a completely unnecessary emergency room trauma response and strongly suggested a psychiatric evaluation for her highly manipulative and dangerous behavior. I thanked the doctor for his honesty, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. The sheer level of toxic manipulation my parents were capable of no longer surprised me. It just fueled my absolute resolve to end this charade permanently. I asked the doctor if she was awake and able to process complex information. He nodded, saying the sedative was very mild and she was fully conscious and alert. I turned and walked out of the consultation room, my heels clicking sharply against the cold linoleum floor as I made my way down the long corridor toward room 4. I pushed open the heavy wooden door to room 4 without bothering to knock. The room was dimly lit by a single glowing monitor mounted above the bed. Vivian was lying back against the crisp white hospital pillows, hooked up to a saline drip and a heart monitor that was beeping with a steady, perfectly normal rhythm. When she heard the heavy door open, she immediately closed her eyes tight and let her head loll to the side, playing the role of the frail dying matriarch, clinging to her final moments on earth. She let out a weak, pathetic groan and fluttered her eyelids open, acting deeply surprised and overwhelmed to see me standing silently at the foot of her hospital bed. She reached a trembling hand out toward me and whispered my name, asking if I had come to make peace before it was too late for our family. She told me she could feel her heart giving out, and she just wanted to know her family and her beautiful home were safe before she passed away into the next life. I did not take her trembling hand. I did not offer her a single word of comfort or sympathy. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the printed medical toxicology report the doctor had just handed me, along with the thick legal envelope containing the official unalterable notice of foreclosure. I stepped up to the side of the bed and slapped the documents down directly onto her lap, the sharp smacking sound making her physically jump in surprise. I told her the performance was officially over. I told her I just spoke to the attending physician, and I knew all about the massive handful of unprescribed amphetamines. She swallowed to fake a sudden cardiac arrest in my lobby. I watched the fake weakness instantly vanish from her face like smoke. Her eyes snapped open wide and sharp, the frail dying woman routine completely disappearing in a fraction of a millisecond. The healthy color rushed back into her cheeks as she stared down at the medical toxicology report resting on her blanket, exposing her entire fraudulent scheme. She realized instantly that I held the absolute medical and financial truth in my hands, and that her desperate manipulative gamble had failed spectacularly. I pointed to the second envelope on her lap. I told her that the second document was the finalized notice of foreclosure on the estate. I explained that because she committed blatant medical fraud using my corporate insurance proxy, I was legally detaching myself from all of her policies, effective by midnight tonight. She was no longer covered, she no longer had a free ride, and she no longer had a home to return to. I told her the bank locks on the country club estate would be changed by tomorrow morning, and all her expensive imported furniture would be seized to pay off the massive subprime debt she and Desmond had hidden for years while they stole my college fund. Vivian's entire demeanor shifted from shocked silence to pure unadulterated panic. She ripped the clear IV line out of the back of her own hand, not even flinching at the small drop of blood that welled up on her skin. She scrambled out of the hospital bed, her bare feet hitting the cold linoleum floor with a slap. The arrogant, untouchable queen of the Atlanta social scene dropped heavily onto her knees right in front of my designer shoes. She grabbed the hem of my tailored jacket, looking up at me with genuine, desperate terror tearing through her eyes. She was not crying for the family she had destroyed. She was not crying for the daughter she had robbed. She was crying solely for the public image she was about to lose. She begged me not to take the house tonight. She screamed that tomorrow evening was the annual Black Excellence Gala at the Grand Ballroom downtown. She cried that she and Desmond were scheduled to be the highly anticipated guests of honor, and they were receiving the prestigious Lifetime Legacy Award for their philanthropic contributions to the city of Atlanta. She sobbed that the entire social elite of the city would be there watching them and waiting to celebrate their generational wealth and flawless reputation. She gripped my jacket tighter, her knuckles turning white as she begged me on her knees, her voice echoing desperately in the sterile hospital room. "Please, Kiara," she sobbed, tears streaming down her face. "Please do not evict us before tomorrow night. Tomorrow is the Black Excellence Gala, and we are receiving the Lifetime Legacy Award. Please let us have this one last night." I looked down at the woman who birthed me groveling on the floor of a sterile hospital room in a cheap paper gown, begging for a few more hours of fake glory. The absolute absurdity of her priorities washed over me like freezing water. Her oldest daughter, Monique, had just been hauled off in handcuffs. Her son-in-law, Trent, was currently sitting in a federal holding cell facing decades in prison, and her husband was secretly raising a whole other family in Florida. Yet all Vivian cared about was a worthless plastic trophy and the applause of a ballroom full of pretentious socialites who would drop her the second they saw her negative bank balance. She clutched my pants, sobbing that they just needed to walk across that stage to maintain their dignity. I stared at her tear-stained face, feeling nothing but clinical disgust. But as I watched her grovel, a new, deeply satisfying plan began to form in my mind. Evicting them tonight in the dark would be too easy. It would allow them to quietly disappear into the shadows and spin some fabricated narrative about being victimized by a cruel misunderstanding. They needed to fall from the very pedestal they had sacrificed my entire life to build. They needed to lose everything under the bright spotlight they craved so desperately. I looked directly into Vivian's panicked eyes and let a cold, slow smile spread across my face. I told her she had exactly 24 hours. I promised her that the bank would not change the locks on the estate, and the moving trucks would not touch a single piece of her imported Italian furniture until midnight tomorrow. I told her she could go to her precious gala and accept her fraudulent legacy award and pretend for one last night that her life was a magnificent success. The instant the words left my mouth, the terror drained from her face, replaced by a sickening wave of immediate relief. She actually smiled, thanking me profusely, and promising that this award would bring in new wealthy investors who could save the family business. She was already back to her delusional plotting, completely ignoring the unalterable foreclosure notice resting on her bed. I did not bother correcting her psychotic fantasy. I simply turned on my heel and walked out of the hospital room, leaving her kneeling on the floor. The long walk down the corridor felt incredibly light. I had given them enough rope to hang themselves, and tomorrow night, the entire city of Atlanta was going to watch them fall. By the next morning, the empire of lies was running purely on toxic fumes and sheer delusion. Monique had been released from police custody pending formal federal charges after surrendering her passport. Her husband Trent was still rotting in a federal detention center with his bail unequivocally denied, but Monique was not spending her morning calling defense attorneys. She was not comforting her traumatized daughter Harper, who had been shipped off to a distant cousin's house after witnessing her mother's complete psychotic break in my lobby. Instead, Monique was frantically pacing the floor of a high-end bridal and evening wear boutique in Buckhead. She was completely broke. Her accounts were frozen solid, and her beloved suburban mansion was currently in the hands of the bank. Yet her only pressing concern was making sure she did not look poor at the Black Excellence Gala that evening. She berated the store clerk for bringing her dresses from last season, demanding to see the newest arrivals. She finally pulled a stolen corporate credit card from her purse, one she had secretly opened using her former assistant's social security number months ago. She callously handed the fraudulent plastic to the clerk to rent a $10,000 heavily beaded silver designer gown. She smiled brightly as the machine approved the stolen funds, completely ignoring the fact that she was actively committing another federal crime while currently out on bail for wire fraud. Meanwhile, Vivian had quickly signed her own discharge papers at the hospital, rushing back to the country club estate before the bank could officially lock the iron gates. She and Desmond immediately began desperately plotting their final masterstroke in the grand dining room of the mansion they no longer owned. The impending foreclosure and the explosive reality of Desmond's secret second family were temporarily pushed aside, ignored in favor of their mutual obsession with public image. They knew I held all the power, and they needed a way to publicly force my hand. Desmond paced across the imported Persian rug, pouring himself a glass of expensive scotch that he could no longer afford to replace. He told Vivian and Monique, who had just arrived carrying her stolen silver dress bag, that they needed to trap me in front of the entire Atlanta social elite. The Black Excellence Gala was going to be filled with billionaires, politicians, and high-profile media outlets. Desmond smiled a wicked, predatory smile and laid out his brilliant ambush. When they were called up to the grand stage to accept their Lifetime Legacy Award, they were going to unexpectedly invite me up to join them under the bright spotlight. They planned to hand me the microphone and publicly announce to the entire ballroom that I had generously decided to merge my highly successful wealth management firm back into the failing family business. They were going to frame it as a massive charitable donation to honor my parents' incredible legacy. Vivian clapped her hands together in delight, her eyes gleaming with toxic excitement. She noted that with 1,000 wealthy eyes watching me and news cameras recording every single second, I would be completely paralyzed by the intense social pressure. I would never dare to cause a public scene or humiliate the family in front of the city's most powerful people. I would be forced to smile politely and agree to their demands, effectively handing them the keys to my entire financial empire just to save face. Monique chimed in, adjusting the heavy garment bag over her shoulder and laughing sharply. She said it was the perfect trap. Once I was publicly committed to the merger, they could use my clean assets to instantly pay off Trent's legal fees, unfreeze her accounts, and save the country club estate from the bank. They spent the entire afternoon rehearsing their beautiful fake speeches, practicing their perfect, humble smiles, and congratulating themselves on outsmarting the daughter they had always considered a naive, useful idiot. They genuinely believed their manipulative social theater would corner me exactly where they wanted me. While my family was busy rehearsing their pathetic extortion plot, I was standing in the master dressing room of my midtown penthouse, enjoying the absolute peace of my own sanctuary. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline as the sun began to slowly dip below the horizon, painting the clouds in brilliant shades of orange and bruised purple. I thought back to the years I had spent working graveyard shifts at the greasy diner, smelling like old frying oil, while studying for my advanced finance exams. I remembered the crushing weight of the predatory student loans my parents forced me to take out while they stole my inheritance to buy Monique luxury cars. Those days were nothing but a distant memory now. My professional makeup artist carefully applied the final touches of a bold dark red lipstick, perfectly complementing my calm, glowing complexion. I stepped into my dress, smoothing the heavy, luxurious fabric over my hips. It was a flawless, custom-tailored stark white silk gown that draped beautifully against my skin. The elegant asymmetrical neckline and the daring slit up the thigh struck the perfect balance between absolute grace and sharp, calculated power. The white dress was a symbol of my total rebirth, untouched by the filth of my family. I looked like a woman who owned the world because I finally did. I stood before the massive, illuminated mirror, staring into my own dark eyes. The insecure girl who used to shrink away from her mother's harsh criticisms and her sister's cruel taunts was completely gone. The woman reflecting back at me was an untouchable fortress of strength and precision. I reached over to my polished marble vanity and picked up a tiny silver USB drive. It was a duplicate of the exact same flash drive Desmond had handed me when he tried to sell Monique out to save his own skin. It contained every single piece of undeniable digital evidence: the forged trust signatures, the embezzled federal loans, the offshore sports betting accounts, and the extensive financial records of Desmond's secret Miami family. I slowly turned the cold metal drive over in my palm, feeling the absolute destructive weight it carried. I slipped the tiny device securely into my diamond-encrusted clutch, snapping it shut with a sharp, satisfying click. I smiled at the mirror, a slow, dangerous smile that held zero warmth and endless promise. It was time to go to a party. The drive to the gala was smooth and uninterrupted. The grand ballroom of the downtown Plaza Hotel was absolutely magnificent, bathed in the warm glow of massive crystal chandeliers and filled with the gentle hum of classical strings. The room was packed with the most influential figures in the city, all wearing expensive tuxedos and shimmering designer gowns. I sat quietly at a table near the front, sipping sparkling water and waiting patiently as the evening progressed through endless speeches and charity auctions. The atmosphere was electric, with the quiet hum of old money and new ambition. People who had previously ignored me now smiled politely, recognizing the shift in my status. Finally, the moment arrived. The master of ceremonies, a prominent local television anchor, stepped up to the grand podium and tapped the microphone. A hush fell over the extravagant crowd. He announced that it was time for the pinnacle of the evening, the presentation of the coveted Legacy Family of the Year award. He spoke passionately about generational wealth, community leadership, and flawless public excellence. The heavy velvet curtains parted, and the spotlight swung sharply to the side of the stage. Desmond and Vivian strutted out into the blinding light, beaming with arrogant, absolute triumph. The applause from this grand ballroom was deafening as they approached the center podium. The room was a breathtaking display of opulent wealth, with towering floral centerpieces draped in dripping crystals and hundreds of Atlanta elite dressed in their absolute finest evening wear. Vivian waved graciously to the standing crowd, her diamond jewelry catching the bright stage lights, projecting the ultimate flawless image of a poised and grateful matriarch. Desmond adjusted his expensive custom tuxedo jacket and leaned into the microphone, letting the roaring applause wash over him before slowly raising his hands to quiet the massive room. His voice boomed through the state-of-the-art speakers, smooth and heavily practiced, dripping with sickening false humility. He thanked the prestigious gala committee for the Lifetime Legacy Award, spinning a beautiful, highly fabricated tale about how he and Vivian had built their financial empire from absolutely nothing through sheer honest hard work. He spoke passionately about generational wealth and the sacred duty of passing down success and strong moral values to their children. He looked out at the sea of wealthy elites, the powerful judges, local politicians, and business moguls who defined Black excellence in the city and fed them exactly what they wanted to hear. He talked about deep family unity, claiming that the true measure of a successful man was how fiercely he protected and supported his own blood against all odds. He masterfully wove in a fake emotional narrative about Monique, vaguely mentioning that his eldest daughter was currently transitioning her beloved boutique into a philanthropic foundation to exclusively help the less fortunate. It was a brilliant, sickening spin specifically designed to cover up her recent federal raids, her entirely frozen bank accounts, and her imminent public bankruptcy. Vivian dabbed at a fake tear in her eye, playing the supportive, emotional mother flawlessly for the flashing cameras. Then Desmond sprang his ultimate public trap. He looked directly at my prominent table near the front of the stage, his eyes locking onto mine with a cold, predatory glint, completely masked by a warm paternal smile. He announced to the entire ballroom that his youngest daughter, Kiara, was the true modern embodiment of their deep family values. He proudly told the crowd that I had recently taken over a massive wealth management firm, and that I was so intensely dedicated to my sister's new philanthropic endeavor that I was here tonight to publicly present Monique's foundation with a $2 million charitable donation. The grand ballroom erupted into thunderous applause and collective gasps of admiration from the wealthy donors. Desmond extended his hand toward me, gesturing broadly for me to join them on stage. The heavy spotlight aggressively swung away from the podium and landed directly on my table, blinding me for a fraction of a second. Every single face in the massive room turned to look at me eagerly, expecting a touching display of sisterly love and generous generational wealth transfer. Desmond had cornered me perfectly. He genuinely believed the sheer crushing weight of the public spotlight and the intense social expectations of Atlanta high society would break my spine. He thought I would be too paralyzed by social etiquette to deny the massive donation and expose the family on live television. He thought I would silently walk up the stairs, smile for the flashing cameras, and hand over the capital needed to bail Trent out of federal prison and save their foreclosed country club estate. I sat in my chair for a long, deliberate moment, letting the heavy silence stretch just long enough to make Desmond sweat visibly under the hot stage lights. Then I slowly stood up, my custom white silk gown flowing flawlessly around my body. The room fell into an odd, supportive hush as I walked toward the stage, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished wooden stairs. I ascended the steps with absolute icy calm, my posture radiating an untouchable energy that made the entire audience hold their collective breath. My flawless white gown trailed gracefully behind me like liquid glass, a sharp, beautiful contrast to the dark velvet stage curtains. Desmond smiled widely, his chest puffed out with pride as he stepped aside to offer me the podium and the microphone, completely convinced his public extortion plot had worked flawlessly. Vivian reached out to hug me for the press cameras. Her fake smile stretched tight across her face, but I smoothly glided past her outstretched arms, leaving her grasping awkwardly at empty air. I stepped up to the microphone, gripping the smooth metal stand, and looked out over the massive sea of expectant faces. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, as they waited for me to announce the $2 million lifeline my family so desperately needed. I did not pull out a checkbook. I did not recite the submissive, obedient script Desmond had tried to force upon me. I looked directly at the crowd and introduced myself properly. I told them it was an absolute honor to be standing before the true architects of Black excellence in Atlanta, but there was a slight correction that needed to be made to my father's touching introduction. I stated in a clear, ringing voice that I was not there as a humble guest of the family, and I was certainly not there to present a charitable donation to my sister's fraudulent boutique. A ripple of confused murmurs washed quickly through the front rows. Desmond's confident smile faltered instantly, his eyes darting nervously toward the dark wings of the stage. I raised my voice slightly, cutting through the rising whispers with razor-sharp authority. I announced to the room that I was actually the sole diamond sponsor of this entire gala. I explained that when I acquired my new wealth management firm last month, I also quietly acquired the massive corporate accounts and the event production companies that funded this very evening. I literally owned the stage I was standing on, and I controlled every single aspect of the entire production. The realization sent a visible shockwave through the elite crowd as people began to sit up straighter in their chairs. Vivian let out a small, terrified gasp, stepping back from the podium as the horrifying truth of my absolute power finally dawned on her. I told the audience that my parents had stood up here and preached about generational wealth and family unity, but their legacy was actually built on a rotting foundation of lies, financial theft, and absolute betrayal. I explained that true excellence requires strict accountability and brutal transparency, and tonight I was going to provide exactly that to the community they had relentlessly exploited. Desmond lunged forward, his face twisting with panicked rage, reaching out to physically grab the microphone and cut my audio feed. But two large private security guards I had personally hired stepped out from the shadows behind the velvet curtain and blocked his path, crossing their massive arms and staring him down. I looked up toward the sound booth at the back of the massive ballroom and gave a swift, decisive nod to the AV production team that worked exclusively for me. I told the crowd that before we handed out any Lifetime Legacy awards, they needed to see exactly what my parents were fighting so desperately to protect. I spoke directly into the mic and commanded the technicians to play the video on the primary screens. The massive digital displays flanking both sides of the grand stage suddenly flickered to life. The elegant gold gala logo vanished instantly, replaced by grainy, high-definition hidden camera footage from inside Trent's private office at his wealth management firm. The massive screens illuminated the entire ballroom, casting a harsh, flickering blue glow over the silent crowd. The video clearly showed Trent sitting behind his massive oak desk, his tie completely undone, and a half-empty bottle of extremely expensive scotch resting dangerously close to his computer keyboard. He was heavily intoxicated, his face flushed and sweating profusely as he slouched heavily in his leather executive chair. Monique was sitting right next to him, holding a delicate glass of wine, and looking completely relaxed and entirely entitled. The audio kicked in crystal clear and echoing flawlessly through the state-of-the-art surround sound system I had paid for. Trent was slurring his words heavily, laughing aggressively as he flipped carelessly through a thick stack of minority client portfolios. He pointed at the sensitive financial paperwork and began spewing the most vile, disgusting racial slurs imaginable. He relentlessly mocked the very people sitting in the ballroom tonight. He explicitly named two prominent black judges, a renowned cardiovascular surgeon, and several wealthy real estate developers who were currently staring up at the giant screens in absolute frozen horror. Trent laughed hysterically, calling them uneducated animals who just got lucky with their money, and bragging loudly about how incredibly easy it was to separate them from their wealth, because they were too desperate for white corporate validation to even read their own financial contracts. He used horrific derogatory terms to describe the country club members, mimicking their voices and insulting their intelligence with brutal racist venom. The most damning part of the video was not just Trent's sickening racism and blatant admission of predatory financial fraud. It was Monique's reaction. Instead of defending her own people or expressing any form of outrage or disgust, Monique just sat there and laughed along with him. She took a slow sip of her wine, smiled a cruel, arrogant smile, and told Trent that he was completely right about all of them. She patted his arm and assured him that her parents' idiot country club friends would blindly sign any federal relief applications she put in front of them because they were pathetically obsessed with her fake luxury boutique. She explicitly agreed to use her minority business status to secure his illegal government funding, laughing about how stupid the entire Black elite community was for trusting them with their money. The video cut to black and the massive digital screens powered down, leaving the grand ballroom in complete, suffocating darkness for 3 agonizing seconds. When the heavy crystal chandeliers slowly faded back up, the silence in the room was heavier than death. It was a terrifying absolute stillness as hundreds of people processed the profound, ugly betrayal they had just witnessed. Then the outrage erupted. It started as a low, dangerous rumble from the back tables and quickly swelled into a deafening roar of pure, unadulterated fury. The affluent crowd, the doctors, the politicians, the legacy families, they were standing up aggressively, knocking over their chairs and shouting in absolute outrage. The people my parents had spent 30 years desperately trying to impress and emulate were now staring at the stage with pure, murderous disgust. Desmond and Vivian were completely frozen under the bright stage lights, paralyzed by a level of horror so profound they could not even move their limbs or speak a single word. Their flawless elite reputation, their precious country club status, their entire meticulously curated identity had just been brutally and publicly executed in front of every single person who mattered in Atlanta. I stood calmly at the podium, listening to the screaming crowd and watching my parents' empire burn entirely to ash. The immediate aftermath of the video was a spectacular eruption of absolute chaos. The deafening silence that had initially choked the grand ballroom shattered into 1,000 pieces of pure, unadulterated outrage. People were not just offended, they were violently disgusted. Judge Clinton, a highly respected Supreme Court justice who had been explicitly name-dropped in Trent's racist rant, stood up so fast, his heavy wooden chair tipped backward and slammed onto the polished marble floor. He pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at my father, demanding to know how long Desmond had been funding his fake philanthropy with stolen blood money. A prominent cardiovascular surgeon sitting near the front row hurled his crystal champagne flute against the stage, where it shattered into glittering shards right at Vivian's feet. The beautiful, carefully curated facade of the Black Excellence Gala dissolved instantly into an angry mob of betrayed investors and furious community leaders. Desmond finally snapped out of his paralyzed horror and lunged toward the edge of the stage, holding his hands out in a pathetic, desperate gesture of surrender. He started shouting over the roaring crowd, begging them to listen, and claiming that Trent was a rogue agent operating entirely on his own. Desmond swore on his life that he and Vivian were completely innocent victims of a sick manipulation and that they had absolutely no idea what was happening behind closed corporate doors. But his desperate, sweaty lies fell on deaf ears because the video had clearly shown Monique sitting right there laughing and agreeing to the entire horrific scheme. The master of ceremonies, the prominent television anchor who had introduced them just minutes ago, stormed back onto the stage. He did not care about professional decorum or the rolling news cameras recording the disaster. His face was twisted with absolute disgust as he snatched the heavy glass Lifetime Legacy Award right out of Vivian's trembling hands. He leaned into his lapel microphone, his voice booming through the speakers, and formally announced to the entire room that the award committee was immediately revoking the honor and fully severing all ties with the family and their businesses. He told them they were a disgrace to the city of Atlanta and a vile stain on the concept of Black excellence. Vivian let out a strangled, horrific sob, stumbling backward as if she had been physically struck. The glittering diamonds around her neck suddenly looked like a cheap, heavy chain dragging her down into the dirt. Several wealthy real estate developers who had heavily invested in Desmond's latest ventures were already pulling out their phones, calling their legal teams and shouting that they were pulling their funding effective immediately. The social currency my parents had literally sacrificed my entire life to build evaporated in a matter of seconds. They were no longer the untouchable king and queen of the elite social scene. They were toxic, radioactive pariahs. Every single billionaire politician and socialite in that ballroom physically turned their backs on the stage, refusing to even look at them. The rejection was absolute and permanent. Desmond stood there, his custom tuxedo suddenly looking ridiculous, as he stared out at the sea of turned backs, processing the undeniable reality that his empire was entirely gone and his legacy was permanently destroyed. I watched the utter destruction of their social standing with cold clinical satisfaction. The screaming and the outrage slowly began to quiet down as the crowd realized I was still standing calmly at the podium. I tapped the microphone once, and the sharp feedback echoed through the cavernous room, bringing everyone to a complete halt. The entire ballroom turned back toward the stage, their anger replaced with a quiet, respectful anticipation. They knew I held the executioner's axe, and they were waiting for the final swing. I looked over at Desmond and Vivian, who were cowering together near the velvet curtains, looking small and incredibly old. I spoke clearly and evenly, ensuring that every single camera in the back of the room captured my words flawlessly. I told the crowd that for 30 years I had been the invisible scapegoat of this family. I had been systematically abused, financially drained, and emotionally discarded, so my parents could fund the fraudulent lifestyle they so desperately craved. I announced that as of this exact moment, I was officially and legally severing all ties with them. I told the crowd that my legal team had already filed the necessary paperwork to dissolve every single joint corporate entity and revoke every medical and financial proxy they had ever used to exploit me. They were completely cut off. No more free healthcare, no more luxury estate, no more hidden bank accounts to fund their pathetic charades. But I was not finished. I explained that when I audited their corrupt financial portfolios, I discovered several massive offshore family trusts that they had illegally drained and hoarded for decades. These were funds that belonged to me and were meant to be my inheritance before they locked me out. I told the ballroom that because I was the sole primary beneficiary on those original accounts and held the ultimate proxy power, I had legally liquidated every single asset within them, totaling just over $8 million. Vivian let out a high-pitched wail, clutching her chest as the reality of her total financial ruin hit her. I ignored her pathetic display and looked out at the silent, captivated audience. I announced that I was redirecting every last cent of that $8 million into a newly established irrevocable scholarship fund. The foundation would be strictly managed by an independent board, and the money would be used exclusively to provide full-ride university scholarships and business grants to underprivileged Black girls across the city of Atlanta. I took the stolen wealth my family had hoarded for their own selfish vanity and gave it back to the very community they had relentlessly mocked and exploited. The crowd erupted. It was not the polite golf claps of high society, but a thunderous, genuine roar of absolute approval and profound respect. The deafening applause washed over me, signaling the absolute end of their reign and the undeniable beginning of mine. Desmond tried to rush toward the podium, his face purple with blinding rage, screaming that I had stolen his money and ruined his life. But the two massive private security guards I had hired immediately intercepted him. They grabbed him by the arms of his expensive tuxedo, lifting him entirely off his feet. The event staff signaled for backup, and half a dozen heavily armed hotel security officers swarmed the stage. They did not treat my parents like honored guests. They treated them like the hostile, trespassing criminals they truly were. The guards grabbed Vivian by her elbows, dragging her forcefully toward the side exit as she kicked and shrieked about her imported shoes and her ruined legacy. The entire ballroom watched in silent satisfaction as the untouchable titans of Atlanta were unceremoniously hauled off the stage like common street thugs. They had absolutely nothing left. Their sprawling country club mansion was locked by the bank. Their accounts were seized. Their son-in-law was in federal prison, and their reputation was permanently incinerated on live television. I stepped away from the podium, ignoring the flashing cameras and the reporters shouting questions from the press pit. I walked calmly down the back stairs of the stage, slipping out through a secure VIP exit that led directly to the private underground parking garage. The humid Atlanta air was thick and heavy, and a massive thunderstorm had just broken over the city. The rain was coming down in thick, blinding sheets, washing the streets clean. My private driver was already waiting, holding a large black umbrella open beside the sleek black Maybach. He shielded me from the pouring rain as I slid into the luxurious leather back seat, the heavy door closing with a solid, comforting thud. The interior of the car was a completely silent, soundproof sanctuary. I leaned back against the plush leather, pouring myself a glass of cold, sparkling water from the mini fridge and letting the profound sense of total victory settle deep into my bones. The engine purred to life, and the driver slowly pulled the massive car out of the parking garage and into the rain-slicked street. As we stopped at the red light just outside the hotel plaza, a frantic figure suddenly darted out from the shadows. It was Monique. Her stolen silver designer gown was completely soaked and plastered to her shivering body. Her expensive hair was matted to her face, and her makeup was running down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. She lunged at the Maybach, slamming her bare hands violently against my tinted passenger window. She was screaming hysterically, begging me to roll down the glass, crying that she had nowhere to go and that her accounts were frozen solid. "Please, Kiara," she shrieked, her voice muffled by the thick bulletproof glass and the driving rain. "Please, you have to help me. I am your sister." I sat perfectly still in the warm, dry luxury of my car, slowly sipping my water and staring right through her desperate, tear-stained face. The traffic light turned green. The driver accelerated smoothly, leaving her sobbing alone in the pouring rain. I watched Monique frantically pounding her bare hands against the reinforced glass of the Maybach, leaving desperate smudged handprints across the dark tinted window. The pouring rain was absolutely relentless, beating down on her stolen silver designer gown until the heavy beaded fabric was completely translucent and clinging to her shivering frame like a wet, discarded trash bag. Her flawless, expensive blowout was plastered against her skull in wet, ragged strands, and the heavy theatrical makeup she had painstakingly applied for the news cameras was now running down her cheeks in thick, dark, muddy rivers of mascara and eyeliner. She looked exactly like what she truly was, beneath the carefully curated facade, an ugly, desperate fraud who had finally run out of lies. She pressed her face against the cold, wet glass, screaming my name over and over again, sobbing that we were blood, and that I could not just leave her out here on the street to face the federal authorities all by herself. The driver glanced at me through the rearview mirror, his expression neutral, but his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, ready to pull away the exact second the traffic light turned green. I raised one single finger, gesturing for him to hold our position for just a moment longer. I reached over to the polished wooden console on the door and pressed the sleek silver button to lower my window. The thick, bulletproof glass glided down exactly 1 single inch. The sudden rush of freezing wet wind and the deafening roar of the Atlanta thunderstorm poured into the silent, temperature-controlled cabin of the car, but I did not flinch. Monique immediately jammed her manicured fingers into the narrow opening, desperately clinging to the edge of the glass, as if she could physically pry her way into my safe, comfortable sanctuary. She gasped for air, choking on her own panicked sobs, and the freezing rainwater splashing into her open mouth. "Please, Kiara," she begged, her voice cracking and pathetic over the sound of the thunder. "You took everything from us." The bank locked the massive iron gates while we were inside the gala. "I have literally nowhere to go and my credit cards are all declining. You have to let me in the car. You owe me this because we are family, and family protects each other." I looked at her bruised, desperate eyes and felt absolutely no pity, no sadness, and zero guilt. I leaned slightly closer to the narrow 1-inch opening of the window so she could hear every single syllable over the crashing storm outside. I looked her dead in the eye and asked her if she remembered my 16th birthday. I watched the deep confusion momentarily break through her sheer panic as her brain scrambled to understand why I was bringing up ancient history while she was actively drowning in the street. I kept my voice entirely flat and devoid of any emotion. I reminded her about the beautiful chocolate cake that Helen, the bakery owner, had made specially for me, because our parents could not be bothered to buy one. I reminded her how she had intentionally bumped into me with her shoulder, knocking the entire cake out of my hands and watching it smash into the dirty linoleum floor of our kitchen. I reminded her how she and Vivian had simply stood there laughing hysterically at my tears, telling me that if I wanted to celebrate my pathetic, invisible existence so badly, I could get down on my knees and eat my birthday cake right off the dirty floor like the dog I was. The memory of that utter humiliation used to burn a massive, painful hole in my chest, but now it just fueled the absolute icy calm running through my veins. I stared at Monique's ruined, tear-streaked face and told her that her performance tonight was permanently over and the applause was dead. I told her to remember the birthday cake and to get down on her hands and knees and eat her new reality right off the wet asphalt. I pressed the silver button and the heavy glass window smoothly rolled up, forcing her to quickly snatch her fingers away before they were crushed. The traffic light turned green and the driver gently pressed the gas pedal. The massive luxury car accelerated smoothly into the dark, wet city streets, leaving my sister screaming and sobbing alone in the pouring rain. Her stolen dress ruined and her entire life completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The fallout from the Black Excellence Gala was absolute and completely merciless. Within 48 hours, the high-definition footage of Trent and Monique spewing vile racist hatred while actively plotting federal wire fraud had blanketed every single major news network and social media platform in the entire country. The social execution was instantaneous and brutal. The wealthy investors who had previously clamored to be associated with Desmond's wealth management firm immediately pulled their massive capital and filed class action lawsuits for gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. The country club permanently revoked their membership, issuing a harsh public statement condemning their actions and scrubbing the family name from every brass plaque in the building. 6 months later, the dust had finally settled over the smoldering toxic ashes of their fake empire, and the reality of their new daily lives was a stark, brutal contrast to the luxury they had always demanded. Trent was officially convicted on multiple federal counts of wire fraud conspiracy to commit bank fraud and massive federal embezzlement. Because of the undeniable video evidence I had provided to the authorities, his high-priced defense attorneys could not negotiate a single favorable plea deal. The federal judge, a stern, unforgiving woman who had zero tolerance for predatory white-collar criminals, sentenced Trent to 10 straight years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Monique managed to avoid serving actual prison time by completely turning on her husband and cooperating fully with the federal prosecutors. But she absolutely did not escape the financial devastation. The federal court ordered her to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in strict victim restitution and completely garnished any future wages until the massive debt was fully satisfied. The former untouchable queen of the Buckhead social scene was now working 40 hours a week at a discount retail store, meticulously folding cheap polyester sweaters and scanning barcodes for minimum wage just to keep herself out of a jail cell. She had to take the public bus to work every single morning because her luxury SUV had been repossessed by the dealership, and the socialites she used to mock now intentionally shopped at her store just to watch her ring up their discounted purchases. Vivian and Desmond faced an equally humiliating and permanent reality. The bank had successfully auctioned off the sprawling country club estate, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the clothes they could quickly pack into black garbage bags before the sheriff escorted them off the property. They were now crammed into a tiny, decaying one-bedroom apartment on the extreme, undesirable outskirts of the city. The walls were paper-thin. The plumbing constantly leaked brown water, and the cheap window air conditioning unit barely worked in the sweltering southern heat. Their days were spent trapped in that claustrophobic, miserable space, constantly screaming and blaming each other for their spectacular public downfall. Desmond bitterly resented Vivian for her obsession with social climbing that ultimately exposed his secret second family, and Vivian deeply loathed Desmond for losing his wealth and forcing her to live like the common working-class people she had always ruthlessly mocked. They were utterly miserable, rotting in their own toxic resentment, and completely abandoned by the high society friends who now fiercely pretended they had never even met them. The only innocent casualty in their entire web of destruction was my teenage niece Harper. After witnessing her mother's psychotic breakdown and enduring the humiliating public spectacle of her father's arrest, Harper had become completely withdrawn and severely depressed. I knew exactly what it felt like to be a discarded, invisible child trapped in a house full of narcissists who only cared about public appearances. I absolutely refused to let her suffer the same agonizing fate I did. Using a portion of the massive trust fund I had legally reclaimed, I quietly reached out to a highly prestigious private boarding school in upstate New York. I fully funded Harper's entire tuition room and board, and specialized psychological counseling for the next 4 years. I made sure the complex legal arrangements completely bypassed Monique's control, ensuring that my sister could never touch a single dime of the educational trust to fund her own lifestyle. Harper was finally safe miles away from the crushing toxicity of Atlanta, thriving in a structured, incredibly supportive environment where she could actually breathe and figure out exactly who she wanted to be without the heavy, suffocating burden of the family name dragging her down. Breaking the generational cycle of trauma and abuse was the greatest and most satisfying investment I had ever made. The warm, ambient lighting of the exclusive rooftop restaurant cast a soft, golden glow over the long, polished mahogany table. It was a cool, crisp autumn evening, and the expansive floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a breathtaking, unbroken panoramic view of the shimmering Atlanta skyline. I sat comfortably at the head of the table, completely surrounded by the people who had truly earned the deeply sacred title of family. My brilliant legal team, who had navigated the complex trust fund extraction with flawless, unyielding precision, sat to my right, laughing warmly and sharing stories about their recent courtroom victories. To my left sat Helen, the woman who had mentored me, believed in my potential, and taught me the profound value of honest hard work when my own mother had treated me like a useless invisible burden. There were no performative tears here tonight. There were no hidden agendas, no toxic underlying competition, and absolutely no desperate, pathetic attempts to impress wealthy strangers for fake social currency. The air was thick with genuine joy, mutual respect, and deep, authentic connection. This was my chosen family, a circle of incredibly successful, grounded, and deeply supportive individuals who valued me for exactly who I was, not for what they could extract from my corporate bank accounts. I looked around the beautiful table, feeling a profound sense of absolute peace settle deeply into the very marrow of my bones. The heavy, suffocating weight of anxiety and the desperate need for parental approval that I had carried for 30 years was completely gone, leaving me feeling incredibly light and entirely free. The elegant restaurant manager approached our private table, discreetly signaling the formal waitstaff. The ambient jazz music faded slightly as two servers walked gracefully toward me, carrying a massive, stunningly intricate tiered birthday cake. It was an absolute masterpiece of culinary art, draped in flawless dark chocolate fondant and adorned with delicate spun sugar flowers that caught the dim restaurant light perfectly. The entire table erupted into genuine warm applause and happy cheers as the servers carefully and securely placed the beautiful cake directly in front of me on the crisp white linen tablecloth. No one bumped aggressively into my shoulder. No one deliberately knocked the heavy tray out of their hands. The gorgeous cake did not smash onto the dirty floor, and absolutely no one stood over me laughing cruelly at my humiliation. It sat there perfectly intact, a sweet, undeniable symbol of my total survival and my ultimate absolute triumph over the people who tried to destroy me. Helen smiled at me, her eyes crinkling with genuine maternal affection, as she handed me a heavy polished silver dessert fork. She leaned in and softly told me to make a wish, but I simply shook my head with a quiet, confident smile. I looked out at the glittering, vibrant city lights of Atlanta, and then back at the glowing faces of the people who truly loved and respected me. I did not need to close my eyes and make a blind, hopeful wish, because I had already meticulously engineered every single thing I could ever possibly want. I leaned forward smoothly, slicing the heavy silver fork through the rich, decadent layers of the beautiful cake, and lifted a generous piece to my lips. I closed my eyes and took a slow, deliberate bite. The rich, dark chocolate melted perfectly on my tongue. It was intensely sweet and incredibly complex, but mostly it just tasted like absolute, undeniable victory. The ultimate lesson is that your true worth is never defined by the people who continually fail to see it. Sometimes the family you are born into will try to keep you small just to make themselves feel big. They will use guilt and manipulation to drain your spirit, but you have the absolute power to break that toxic cycle. Standing up for yourself is not an act of betrayal, it is an act of profound self-love. When you finally let go of the desperate need for their approval, you make room for the authentic life you actually deserve. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member to find your own peace? Share your experience in the comments below and subscribe for more empowering stories.